Good evening from New York City. I am Andrea Lipps, Associate Curator of Contemporary Design at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, one of two Smithsonian museums in New York. Thank you for joining us here in virtual space. And although we are gathering today from different places and different locations, we acknowledge with humble gratitude the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we are zooming in from tonight, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their homes in those locations today. For myself in Manhattan, I am on Lenape-Hoking territory. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to tonight's event featuring artist and designer Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg with special guest, conservation scientist Kent Redford. I am honored to share the screen with them this evening, and thanks to you both for being here with us tonight. So this program is a part of Viewfinder, Women's Film and Video from the Smithsonian, a year-long virtual screening and conversation series featuring a range of moving image works by women across Smithsonian's collections, and that is generously sponsored by the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative. Each virtual program in the series will occur on the first Thursday of each and every month. Next month's program is Leslie Thornton on Surviving at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, August 5th. For more information about upcoming events in the series, you can visit the website womenshistory.si.edu/events/viewfinder. For tonight's program, we do have live closed captioning available, which you can access along the bottom menu, as can the Q&A function, into which you are welcome and encouraged to submit questions to be answered during the latter half of our event. I am thrilled that you have joined us for this special screening and discussion around Daisy's video installation, The Substitute, a work from 2019 that is part of Cooper Hewitt's digital design collection. So our discussion this evening is foregrounded by Daisy's artistic practice, in which she examines humans' fraught relationship with nature and with technology, largely through digital media installations. Her work explores extinction, synthetic biology, conservation, biodiversity, bioengineering ethics, evolution, and much more, all in pursuit of investigating the human impulse to better the world around us. Daisy's practice is nothing if not ambitious. She untangles these webs of ideas through technologically complex multimedia installations, and they end up as these emotionally resonant stories. They are works that are sticky. They just stay with you. And The Substitute has been an incredibly sticky work for me ever since I first saw it. So at a moment when one of the threats facing our planet is significant biodiversity loss, I'm curious to explore ideas around the role that moving image and digital media play in tackling massive issues like extinction. I mean, it begs the question whether they have a role at all. At the very least, as Daisy's practice attests, video works can provoke us to talk, to imagine, to question, to reconsider. In our context tonight, it provides a springboard to dive more deeply into broader issues addressed in The Substitute. For instance, in de-extinction efforts, what do we want to keep and what do we want to lose? Who gets to decide? How do we balance reconstruction, preservation, and conservation as possible approaches to potential species lost? What strange natures are we actively or even passively creating? I am thrilled that Kent Redford is here to unpack these ideas with Daisy and me. Kent is a prominent conservation scientist whose roles have included leading teams at the Nature Conservancy. He was the director of the Wildlife Conservation Society Institute, and he is now principal of Archipelago Consulting, where he works with prominent foundations, with the World Bank, and other conservation organizations, all while prolifically publishing on conservation practice, including his latest book that I have yet to finish, but I'm close to it, called Strange Natures. So it has been a privilege and a pleasure to think deeply about Daisy's work, and I look forward to discussing these questions and more with the artist and designer, with Kent, and with all of you. So for the evening's order of events, We will first watch documentation of the substitute from its premiere at Cooper Hewitt in 2019. This first video is just over 2 minutes in duration, and it shows one of 3 loops of the video installation. This will then be followed by a brief discussion with Daisy and myself to just contextualize what we've just seen. That will then be followed by documentation screening of the full installation, all 3 loops of the substitute. Daisy will then narrate over the 3rd loop of this documentation, and then we will move into the heart of our discussion with Daisy and with Kent, followed by questions from you, our audience. So thank you so much. Daisy, it gets me every time. It really does. I just imagine being in that gallery and staring face to face with a full-scale adult rhino. So tell us, Daisy, about the concept and the context for this work.
Well, I think we've got some images that we can share, which is maybe a helpful start. Well, really, it starts with you, Andrea, because I wrote to you and said, I have an idea. And you were very graceful with a proposal that I had no idea how to make. But the story really started on March the 20th in 2018, when Sudan, the last male northern white rhino, appeared in the newspapers around the world because he'd been euthanized the day before. And I had no idea that there was only one male northern white rhino left at that point. And what I found so strange about that news was the way it was reported. So this tragedy, the loss of essentially a species or a subspecies, and yet there was this hopeful tone to a lot of the articles that it's going to be okay because we can bring him back. And there were reports of different conservation efforts using 2 different methods that are sort of underway. One is using sperm taken from Sudan, and the hope is that it would be possible to do IVF with potential surrogate in southern white rhinos, which are closely related subspecies. And there's another effort which involves using stem cells, so skin tissue samples taken from Sudan, and other kinds of cells that are then transformed into stem cells, which could then potentially create a whole new rhino. And that was really the starting point for the work, because I was just sort of sitting there scratching my head thinking, what is this? Twitter had recommended this news to me, and I found it so strange that an algorithm had delivered this news to me. And then a couple of weeks later, I was going to be on a panel at the Science Museum in London that was called Artificial Life, Could We, Should We, Will We? And I found myself having an existential crisis on stage with some computer scientists and other experts, someone from DeepMind, and thinking, what are we talking about? We're talking about creating artificial life and whether we'll be able to simulate lifelikeness or even create intelligence. And yet at the same time, just 2 weeks ago, this tragedy happened, and we had this extraordinary piece of artificial life that we completely failed to preserve or protect. And with that goes this whole kind of question for me about how much do we invest in artificial life, and why do we ignore, fail to protect and preserve what already exists? Why is there this desire for the new, for the innovative, and a complete blind approach to the nature that we are part of and that we cannot live without? So that happened, and I was sitting on stage sort of thinking, this is super weird. And then a couple of weeks later, a friend sent me a paper that had just been published by DeepMind, and there's an image with just a report on it that we can show, which is sort of one of the headlines that covered this news. So DeepMind is an artificial intelligence company, which is part of Google, and a scientist there called Andrea Lipps had led a team, and they had created an artificial agent, so a piece of AI that could navigate around a virtual room. And they were studying how this piece of AI learned to understand the space it was in. And what they discovered was that the system created a very similar solution to the way the mammalian brain has evolved to map space. So in our brain, there are these things called grid cells, which create a kind of hexagonal shaped grid that fires, and it's almost like a GPS that's overlaid onto a space. It's how we understand where we are. And they discovered that the AI solved the problem of understanding where it was in a very similar way. And that was, for me, another sort of piece of the puzzle, just thinking how strange this was, that these artificial lifelikeness or lifelike forms could sort of replicate something. And why were we investing our time in doing this when we had this extraordinary thing, which, you know, when it really comes down to it, social measures are why rhinos have gone extinct. It's our choices of different peoples, and certainly, you know, beginning with colonization. So then the next piece in the puzzle was thinking about Dürer's rhinoceros. So this is this famous print from 1515. And my father has a table at home covered in little rhino objects. And he also has a framed print of this in the wall. And I always used to look at it. And I suddenly thought, well, this again is another really interesting lifelike reproduction of a rhinoceros. So Dürer never saw this rhino. He created this image, which became one of the most widely distributed reproductions of the rhinoceros in the Enlightenment, and was this image traveled around Europe and the world in different books and prints. And he never saw this rhino. This rhino was shipped from India to the King of Portugal, who thought it was so amazing that he then decided to ship it on to the Pope, and it died in a shipwreck. And so it never got there. And Dürer heard reports of this thing and drew this rhino based on it, which is why we have armor and this extra horn on its back, which for me was this wonderful story of some errors in reproduction. So this was the point where I emailed you, Andrea, and said, I have an idea. And it's all sort of started to come together as how do we talk about this error in reproduction if we could recreate the northern white rhino through a technological means, just as Dürer did here? Would it still be a northern white rhino? So if a northern white rhino is born to a southern white rhino, how does it learn to be a rhino? Or how does it learn to be its own kind of rhino? And so that led me to like an ecologist who works with sound. I think it's called an ethologist, called Dr. Richard Pollock, who's based in the Czech Republic. And he had worked with the last northern white rhinos when they were in a zoo in the Czech Republic, and there were 8 of them at that point, including Sudan, and the last 2 females. And he'd been recording their sounds and their vocalizations, and he explained to me that they were the most social of all the rhino subspecies. And so the sounds that you heard in that video, those squeaks and grunts, were actually taken from recordings that he sent to me. And of course, 6 of those rhinos are no longer with us, and the 2 females have been sent to Kenya. And they're too old to reproduce, but the effort is to try and take their eggs and do IVF with them. So then for me, the challenge was, well, how do I reconstruct a rhino from my studio in London? And I mean, I can carry on if you want, Andrea, to tell you about that challenge, but.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear about.
So it turns out it's quite difficult to cook up a rhino, as the various scientists involved are discovering, and how, and then from my position, this thing was haunting me, is that I need to basically reproduce this rhino. So I contacted DeepMind and said, I'm totally fascinated by your research. And then I was also talking to a friend who's at a visual effects studio production house in London that does Hollywood effects, called The Mill. And it turned out they had a southern white rhino model. So what you saw in the video is the beginnings of our northern white rhino. And this southern white rhino had actually appeared in an energy drink commercial in Brazil. And we were able to transform him into a northern white rhino, so making subtle changes to his anatomical features, hairier ears, for example, changing the shape of his back and his head. And the secret bit is that I ran out of money basically when we were making this, because the mill were very kindly giving us a lot of support, and I was only allowed to make a few changes. So it was this very interesting process of how do I transform a southern white rhino to a northern white rhino on a budget. And I realized about 6 weeks after we'd signed off the model that he didn't have testicles. We'd completely failed to model these, and obviously there was no budget left. But it was in a way a really happy accident in the work, because the substitute is neither male nor female. He is, or she is, it is a stand-in for the rhino subspecies that has been lost. So when we see him wandering around the room, he's sort of coming to life, and we'll see more in the video that will follow, showing the full loop, that each time he's constituting from a set of blocks and then becoming increasingly lifelike. And then there's this moment where he looks you in the eye and disappears. So the animators worked with scenes that we took from Dr. Pollitt's footage of these rhinos in the zoo. So the particular sort of these emotional moments, or what we perceive as emotional moments, and and I think Kent will also be able to tell us more about this. But this moment of recognition of it looking at you, that you become the subject, and he's the gallery goer in his box in a way, was something that I really wanted to do. And the way that he moves around that space, I've got an image that we can look at. It is based on DeepMind's experiment. So DeepMind allowed us to use the kind of AI tool that was the basis of their research paper, of Andrea Lipps' research paper. So if we just flick through this set of images, we see, and we'll see a bit more of this in the video to come, but what you see on the left is the rhino's route generated by this piece of software. And on the right is the development of these grid cells. So as he wanders around the space more, he is becoming essentially. So this blocky imagery that we used for the rhino was a reference to this grid cell creation, this series of synthetic cells within an AI. So the work isn't generated by AI. In a way, the substitute is performing the journey that a piece of AI took. And it's something that I've been able to do in later works, is actually use AI within the work. But I think it will become more clear as we see more of the work. But it was an extraordinary thing to do, I think, and I'm so grateful to you, Andrea, for bringing him to this version of lifelikeness, because it's an incredibly strange experience in the gallery, I think, because what we see is children running up to him and wanting to interact, and then he's not there. But at the same time, it's probably the closest we'll ever get to a northern white rhino. And that's really what the work is, for me, trying to unpick is this the substitute we deserve? Or is this the archival copy that we need? It's imperfect. Is it better than nothing? It's full of errors, like the testicles, but also it's not a true northern white rhino copy. But is it also easier if it's not the real thing? Do we have a different kind of emotional attachment to it? We know it can be constantly reproduced, constantly reappear and disappear for us, and perform for us, basically.
And on that, actually, I would love to invite us to take a look at the full 3 loops of the installation itself. So Daisy and I will now stop our video and we'll watch the full installation. Oh, beautiful, thank you. You know, and I think that you telling us about, you know, just the size and the scale of the rhino himself also portends why it is important for us to actually be viewing this as documentation and not just as the straight video itself. I remember once, Daisy, you telling me that, you know, your intention was not to show this as, you know, a video just on your computer, so that the rhino is, you know, what, 6 inches, 6 inches long.
It's true. I mean, I think the full effect is definitely experienced in the gallery, and also because of the sound. And I remember when we showed it at the nature, the triennial at the Cooper Hewitt, and it was the sound of his footsteps and squeals echoing across the whole exhibition. But those are, you know, that was something we really worked on, is how to convey that monumentality of this extraordinary creature.
Yeah, and it definitely worked. And, you know, one of the things I wanted to start out exploring with both you, Daisy, and Kent is, I mean, this idea about storytelling and why it's so important, and thinking about storytelling through moving image and through video in particular. You know, so Daisy, you would told us about some of the design decisions, which at times are motivated through budget. And in a strange way ends up being appropriate. I mean, he's unable to reproduce. But thinking about video installations and video work itself, I mean, this is not necessarily something you always use in your practice. I mean, you have worked with creating audio and scents, smells. You've created objects, you've created prints. So why with the substitute do you think that moving image was sort of the media?
But it was hard to make my own rhino in flesh. No, I'm being facetious, but also true. I think it was, how do you tell the story? And the Jura rhino is such a powerful icon for the last 500 years of what we understand a rhinoceros to be, and the rhinoceros as a kind of symbol of the Enlightenment. It was a symbol of knowledge. So there's also a really important piece of the story. So I mentioned that he was in a Brazilian energy drink commercial, but it's about travel. So the idea of colonial destruction, things being shipped around the world, the videotapes of the Czech rhinos that have been taken from Africa to Czech Republic, sent back to Africa, this rhino that traveled from India and then on to Italy and died in a shipwreck. This digital rhino that went from LA to Brazil, then back to LA to London. And these are the stories of how we treat living things, and we ship them around for our own entertainment. And so video becomes a very good way to, I think, to explore that. And also it is a reproduction. So this idea that now this rhino lives in split forms in different museums around the world. He's currently in a park in Athens making a noise. It's a way to talk about the synthetic. And that's where Kent's work, I think, is so fascinating. So I first met Kent in 2013 when he organized a conference about synthetic biology and conservation. And I basically changed my practice after attending that conference, because I'd been working with synthetic biologists for about 5 years, and suddenly there was this way to expand into the natural world that was being presented, which I hope Kent's going to tell us more about. And it raises so many questions about what is real and what do we understand nature to be, and can you copy it and recreate it?
And this idea about, again, storytelling. I'm so fascinated, Kent, that you actually said to Daisy that, stories need to be told now. We're at that point within conservation efforts. So can you talk to us a little bit more about, your plea to her or to artists in general? I mean.
Sure. Someone once told me that the 4 magic words you can use to quiet anybody, anywhere, if you speak the right language, is once upon a time. And it reaches deep into our limbic system somewhere and gets us to stop, but not only to stop, but to open up. And as someone said, what follows once upon a time is always a lie, because that's why it's once upon a time. But we are willing to suspend our disbelief, which would ordinarily be at high alert, and allow whatever is being said to us to penetrate deeply. And I have come to to think that, whereas we think that as rational human beings, that we have one way of understanding truth or facts and another way of understanding fiction and stories. I think these doors are marked as those 2 different labels, but they actually open in the same room. And once whatever it is that gets in there, it starts messing around. I mean, we have only to look at the political situation in many countries, including certainly in the US now, to see how fact and fiction commingle and then come back out those doors as their own creatures, as Daisy's rhino is. They're a strange mixture of the real and the story, and the false and the marvelous. And I spent 30 years being trained as a scientist to believe that if we could provide better information, it would lead to better decision making. And it was called something that's called the knowledge deficit theory. And I think it's completely wrong. I think that science is still practicing it much of the time, but I think stories may lead to better decision making, better than better knowledge might do so. And so, I've been to talks about northern white rhinos and ran a session at the San Diego Zoo and wrote a paper, and there's been absolutely zero response. And whereas Daisy shows her digital rhino made from a Brazilian energy drink, and people start to cry. And I think, what the hell? Spent 30 years and wrote and published a paper, and she got a grant from a design museum, and she's affected people in ways that conservation scientists haven't been able to. And so more power and more stories.
And I think so much of that is thanks to just, the power of art and design itself, and I think that really is the role that moving image, that art and design have to play in this sphere, is to tell these stories, to present them to broader audiences, if you will. There is something which, thinking about that those 4 words, Kent, once upon a time, and how it activates something in our limbic system. There is something that we respond to things that make us more emotional. Whether it's a part of our lizard brain, I don't necessarily know. And I think that is something that that's so incredibly potent about the substitute, is that at least for me, and you actually saw those were my kids that were running through the installation. You saw for my son, who was 5 years old at the time, when he totally unprovoked went up to the screen and tried to hug Sudan that he saw on the screen. And it's like, there is something that is emotionally resonant about that. And again, and I think it's that resonance that it's like, it's stickiness. It sticks with you then, and makes you care a little bit more, for better or for worse, whether, it's sad that we can have all this information and knowledge and not want to act on it more. That sometimes it does take the storytelling in which to do that, but it's an important part to play in all of it.
Well, and these stories can have negative conservation impacts. So in a little reported story, the illegal trade in owls in Southeast Asia went hugely up after the Harry Potter films were screened. Because everybody wanted an owl, because they play such an important part in Hogwarts. And for those of you who haven't seen the films or read the book, owls are very important. So people want to own owls. So everybody's going out and trapping owls and selling them where to lead nasty short lives, British short lives in people's houses. And, same with Catching Nemo, clownfish, huge bump in trade, people wanting to own Nemo. Owning, the whole point of the film was that Nemo was free and returned home. And the human response to that is, I want one. Yeah. I want to own that. And so, stories don't always lead to happy endings for the things that are featured in them. Yeah. We just hope that the substitute will result in positive returns.
To the extent that it can, right? Ultimately the substitute is provoking us with these ideas around de-extinction. And, Ken, I actually would love for you to help us understand a little bit more the approaches to addressing species loss. From what I understand, there's conservation, preservation, reconstruction, and de-extinction. So, what are the mitigation strategies there?
Sure. So first, for those of you who didn't see the headline, a large UN body put out a report saying that 1 million species at least are endangered as of now, and a good number of those have gone extinct. And even more importantly, in some ways, the numbers of animals within a population is going way down, which is a very unfortunate heralding of an increase in future extinctions. And these threats have come about through indirect loss and direct loss, disease, and things like that. And so the conservation strategies include, as you listed off, Andrea, conserving habitat, preventing killing, trying to prevent disease, much conversation about that during the pandemic, increasing population size, helping animals and plants move around, trying to shift the pattern for the impacts of climate change, and then of course de-extinction. And so de-extinction comes onto the stage, I don't know, like some operatic diva, and it has drawn more attention from the public. It's become a bit of a bijou topic, and it's drawn clusters of people flittering and fluttering around, and the ethicists love the topic and have written a lot about it. And it is commonly understood to be bringing back things that have gone extinct. But as you dust off, dig even slightly below the surface, you realize that the people who are serious about this topic are not proposing to bring back exactly what was lost, but rather to bring back a version of what was lost. And that version, for many people who are practitioners, advocates of this, that version of what was lost that you want to bring back was something that functions ecologically in ways similar to the species that was lost. So it is really an argument about the actions of an animal, in this case an animal, and wanting to bring back something that would act like that animal. And so in the case of the mammoth, which has been much discussed, the interest is in bringing back something that would behave like a mammoth and therefore help preserve Arctic ecosystems. We can go into that if anybody cares. But it's being proposed to be done by taking an Indian elephant, as Daisy took the model for a Brazilian sports drink, and then back into it the genetics that have been taken from frozen baby mammoths that have been found in the tundra, until you get something that is a bit like a Indian elephant, but a bit like a mammoth. But you would get an A+ from the teacher if this hybrid that you create would behave in ways that mammoths are thought to have behaved when put back into the Arctic. So de-extinction is in fact a slippery term, unless you understand that it's the functional part that people are most interested in returning. And there's another example about passenger pigeons if you care, or we can move on.
Well, actually, I'm interested in thinking about that idea about behavior. I mean, this, Daisy, was something that you've even brought up with Sudan, as you mentioned. You know, if there are no other northern white rhinos for this surrogate to learn from, is that actually then a northern white rhino?
And that's my question. Maybe Kent can. Well, I don't know the answer. I think it's incredibly fascinating to think of, the human equivalent of there's a language that we learn, but how much of a species that doesn't have language, it's speaking a different kind of language. It's a social species. Different calls mean different things. But if you don't have your social group to learn from, so there's lots of research in birds that shows how they learn song. They may be born with an innate pattern for singing, but if they're isolated from other birds and never hear another bird sing, their songs don't become as complex, because the dawn chorus, the communication between them is learned as well and passed on. And I think what Richard Pollock was doing was he was working on trying to understand the dynamics of these conversations by identifying sounds and matching them to behaviors. But as he worked with these last 8 rhinos, they slowly died off, and so that is a lost piece of research in a way, or incomplete. So I mean, Kent, do you know anything can you guide us towards how we might understand the difference between social and cultural behaviors of different species and things that are, as we understand, encoded in DNA and will be passed on when it comes to resurrecting species?
Certainly, I'll refer to that, but I would like to start by observing that by the time you are sampling the life of a northern white rhino from 8 animals in a Czech zoo, you already have lost multiple layers of rhino-ness. The qualities of being a rhino really require that it be out there in the wild with the potential for death and the potential for fights and wallowing and group defecation and calling back and forth and losing your mother and dispersing as a young male, all of those things. And then you add to that the microbiome, the hundreds and thousands of microbes that are living in every animal and most plants. So the microbiome of the Czech zoo rhinos is not the Sudanese northern white rhino microbiome. It's left it behind. It has a simulacrum of its original microbiome. So all of these things have been stripped away from the rhino by the time it shows up in your sphere and of trying to capture it, Daisy, and we would have to layer those back on. And what a fascinating art project it would be to start with a digital rhino and start to work on what you would need to put back on top of it to end up with a single northern white rhino. And then you'd have to do that multiple times to get a social group. And of course, you'd have to iterate to get multiple social groups, et cetera, and off you go. And so we don't have that. And nor will we probably ever be able to get that back. So the question is, what is going to be good enough? So we now know, I looked this up, we now know what the genome of microbiome is. a genome of the northern white rhino, and it's 2,666.62 million base pairs. So there is a computer somewhere which has digitally recorded a northern white rhino, which ought to be the instructions in an ideal world that you would need to recreate it. And I was just reflecting on how the digital genome, what it would be like in digital space to meet the pixels from your substitute and see what would happen if those two were to try to interact as two different versions of a northern white rhino. And who knows, maybe as artificial intelligence goes on, it'll start doing those sorts of things. So the zoo we've already lost a lot in the zoo, and the attempts to recreate, which are now in place that you described briefly, using both in vitro and in vivo fertilization, and even more complicated using these stem cells, may bring us back two or three or four, but it's going to be hard to imagine that it's going to bring us back the full deal. And Sudan, if you look at what's happening in Sudan, where would these things go? I mean, we must not refuse to look at the suffering of the humans who are in Sudan and what it would take if you really wanted to put these rhinos back in terms of what you'd have to do for the people there as well. And the task is a major one. And so the storytelling, it may be that the substitute is like an ambassador. I read a book about medieval hostages, and it turned out that in the Middle Ages, hostages were sent not the way we think about hostages now, but to actually become part of families and social groups in the enemy or the potential allies' castle. And it may be that the substitute is really an ambassador from white rhinodom, who is here to become part of us and to be represented and put on display in Cooper Hewitt the way the original rhino was put on display in the courts in Lisbon. And in the courts of Lisbon, that rhino created an enormous impression that echoed all the way through to Douro. And I would like to think that your rhino ambassador will do the same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about him as an ambassador. In many ways, I've often thought about him as a bit of a Trojan horse, a Trojan rhino, if you will. That you watch him, but it really does just open up all of these other issues, that is fantastic that we're able to talk about today, and to touch other audiences with today. And it's interesting, thinking around all of these issues with de-extinction, because the de-extinction efforts of the northern white rhino species are happening. I mean, they're underway. I don't follow it probably as closely as you do, Kent, or even potentially you, Daisy, but I definitely have seen news reports, of the successful insemination, or not. I don't think they've inseminated yet, but they've at least created the eggs.
I think they've created embryo. Yeah, they've got embryos, but then, and the ovaries are sort of 5 foot inside these 2 females. So it's incredibly risky to get the eggs out of the last 2 females. And then the next step is to see if it's possible to actually implant the embryos. Is that right, Ken?
Yes.
I mean, it's wild to think about that. I mean, that this is underway, and it makes me wonder, what are the values, or potentially what are the emotions that are driving these types of decisions, that are driving this type of work? Because I think, Kent, you certainly have laid out the what then scenario. Where would these things live? I mean, we're bringing them back.
I see them as, this is really the question that kind of kicked off this whole piece for me, was the kind of fetishization of AI and the lack of interest in preserving what already exists, or the lack of sense of urgency of why it matters, whether these animals, these creatures, as we are creatures, have an ethical right to exist alongside us. But it's also, if we do create this technological object that is a technologically reconstructed biological rhino, not only is it a rhino, but what is it for? And is it just, as Kent was describing, these, in the courts of the royal courts of Portugal, of Lisbon, in the 16th century, is it just it's a curiosity? And why would we look after that one more than the ones that we've already failed to look after? And is it because it's a production of human ingenuity and technology? But if it is, then why don't we apply that same ingenuity to preserving biodiversity? But I'd really like to ask Kent a bit more. So the work that, the conference I mentioned in 2013 that Kent organised, or co-organised at Cambridge, where conservationists and synthetic biologists came together, for me, for the first time in a very strange couple of days of trying to, for me, it felt like almost like a first date between these 2 communities of, do we like each other, or we'll have some drinks and see where it goes, because they're 2 groups that you wouldn't naturally see together, and Kent has been really instrumental in these conversations, because the rhino is charismatic megafauna. He's like big and beautiful and can tell a story, but it's the other kinds of work that's ongoing that fascinates me. And Kent, maybe you could talk more. I mean, I think the example of coral and engineering coral is so interesting, because it starts to seep into this problem of what is real nature, and how synthetic biology can be used in other kinds of ways.
Certainly. But I want to touch first, because I looked it up and I was so interested. I will answer a question, but I do want to talk about the word fetish, because I looked up its etymology, and it comes from the Portuguese fetico, meaning charm or sorcery, but originally it was an adjective meaning made by art, from the Latin. So the fetish is what it is. It's exactly what the substitute is, if we go back to its origin. And so, yes, there we have the artist and the object. So synthetic biology is a collective term for the set of tools that are being developed and deployed by many people, geneticists and synthetic biologists, to try and change nature so that it produces things that humans want. And it is most developed for microbes, for bacteria and small things like that, which are having their own genetic material very precisely altered so that they will produce things that humans want. So for example, vanillin, which is the chemical most often used in artificial vanilla, is now being produced by microbes, which have had their genomes changed, so they don't have any choice but to produce this stuff. And so then they're imprisoned in vats and made to pump out vanillin, which shows up in the less expensive vanilla ice cream and household sprays that you may purchase. So those technologies then are also being deployed very significantly in agriculture to try and change both domesticated crops and animals to use less fertilizer, to grow faster, to produce new crops, to survive climate change, many sorts of things. So the conservation community, only on its very small margins, learned about these technologies and asked, wow, I wonder whether or not we could deploy some of those to actually try and address intractable threats to biodiversity, because we're not winning, we're losing the fight. So that the topic crept into the conservation world, and it immediately stimulated a huge counter response from within the conservation community saying, you can't possibly consider doing that. It's against nature, it's playing God, it's unnatural. And these sets of concerns have revealed an extraordinarily deep rift in the community about whether or not it's acceptable to change things in order to save them, which is basically at the heart of the question. Because if I can conserve something by changing it so that it doesn't suffer from a disease, let's say, then it has survived, but it's no longer it. It's now some version of it, because if it had been it would have died. And so there are people who would rather see it, in our example, go extinct than see it altered. So we received, and Daisy will have heard this because I read it at the meeting, I received an anonymous email the day before this meeting started from someone who said, I cannot believe that the conservation community is actually considering the use of technology to try and save nature, which is being destroyed by technology. You are like a drug addict who believes that one more dose will solve your addiction. And I know you'll never, read this, but that's my opinion. And so we read it to the audience because that's the way people feel. If technology is the problem, how could it possibly be the answer? And yet, I'll follow up this coral case that Daisy mentioned. So reef building corals, particularly in tropical waters, are dying as a result of warming oceans and increasing acidification of the oceans due to more CO2 in the atmosphere due to climate change. And there are people busy at work to try to genetically alter reef building corals so they can survive in warming oceans. So this is an example. It's a litmus test. You either say, fabulous, we're going to save the reefs, maybe, if it works, we don't know. Or you say, how could you possibly do that? That is not what conservation should be. And that's where we're perched right now in this argument. And I'm very much in the middle of it. And so that's what the simulacrum is. That's what this focus on de-extinction is. That's why the legitimacy and whether it's an accurate depiction or the actual thing ends up mattering a lot in the real world of trying to make conservation decisions.
Fascinating. So I just want to turn quickly. We do have one question, and I'm just going to read this out verbatim to us. This person says, I was really intrigued by the notion that once an animal is anthropomorphized in stories, everyone wants to own one. Is that a potential of this digital capture as well? Is there a way to embed in the storytelling a dissuasion from leading to a desire to own, capture, or contain?
That one for me.
Sure.
Well, you take a run, and then I'm going to talk about three-legged dogs.
Okay. I think it's such a great question. I'm well, in a way, so what I'm doing next is actually playing with that, but it is going the other way. It's using the value of the artwork to encourage everyone to own one and create one. But in this case, it's a pollinator garden. So how do you escape the gallery and allow everyone to have their own edition? And to create their edition, they're planting flowers. So it's a commission I'm working on for the Eden Project in Cornwall, in the UK, which will launch in September. So that's not the answer. That's the next experiment. Because there is one issue for me with the substitute is when I see it in a gallery is what am I asking people to do? What agency am I giving them? I'm inspiring a sense of loss. You know, as Kent described it so beautifully, it's an ambassador, but you know, am I meant to donate to save the rhino? What am I meant to just, in the same way I read those headlines 3 years ago, I feel sad, and then 2 days later it's forgotten and on to the next thing.
Yeah. You know, and some of this also gets back to that question of, you know, what are we prioritizing in making some of these decisions to move forward with these efforts, you know, and is there a human desire for ownership? You know, is it,
But let me ask you, Andrea, what is the responsibility of your museum to the audience that is seeing daisies? So maybe you are, I don't know, but so maybe there's a responsibility on the part of the Smithsonian, which by the way has a zoo and a natural history museum and Barra Colorado and Panama, to interpret Daisy's exhibit in ways that maybe she didn't include, but you think is important. You know, we've all been raised that we need to be thinking differently, at least in the US, about statues of Confederate war heroes. Maybe there is the same logic that should be being applied to a design museum showing a northern white rhino.
right. You know, and it's so interesting too, because, you know, obviously for Smithsonian, it's so much about the dissemination and diffusion of knowledge. And we're doing so. I mean, we're quickly approaching our 175th anniversary as an institution in this country. I mean, for us, Daisy, that's huge. It's very, very old to actually have an institution that has been around for that long.
With British money, it started, so.
Exactly. And what is actually really fascinating, and Kent, when you were talking a lot about the conservation efforts themselves, and this idea that in order to keep something alive, or, you know, or to preserve something, you had to change it. And it's actually something which we are encountering with non-carbon based work, if you will, things that are not alive. And it is specifically in line with things like the substitute. So any, you know, digital based works that are, you know, either embedded in code or exist as files. And what we are finding is, you know, our traditional approaches of conserving works, which have largely been stasis, you know, not allowing any change whatsoever. We actually are now having to completely embrace change and to allow something to be in perpetual motion, if you will, in order to be kept alive. And this is very specific, again, to, you know, to digital works. This doesn't apply to paintings. It doesn't apply to, you know, a teacup and whatnot, which do much better sitting on a shelf. You know, but for digital works in particular, we're actually having to completely re-theorize, if you will, and generate new theories and philosophies about how we are actually able to maintain these things. And, you know, and certainly I think that idea of storytelling itself remains incredibly important to all of us, that, you know, we have these objects in Smithsonian's collections, which, you know, at the moments of their acquisition probably told certain stories and now tell very different stories with the lenses that we have.
So two thoughts. The first is, you know, I understand the Smithsonian's mission is diffusion of knowledge, but go back to the earlier comment I made about the knowledge deficit fallacy. I mean, I think it's not good enough anymore to just diffuse knowledge. I think it's almost irresponsible. So then what? I mean, not just going to change your mission, but then what? But also I was thinking about curating, and perhaps you know this, but there is a growing movement to store digital files on DNA. And so they, the amazing fact is that the contents of the entire Library of Congress could be stored in a liter bottle of soft drink of DNA. So it would be interesting as an extension of the substitute to store the digital files on DNA that could perhaps have been extracted from a museum specimen of a northern white rhino. I mean, you could really spin people's heads around, in a particularly attractive way, if you could imagine doing that. Once you're done with pollinator gardens, Daisy, you could work on that.
Well, so much of it is that question of atoms and bits. I mean, they're really, the more you start to look at them and think about them, I mean, there's something there, which they're not all dissimilar. We have another question. Could Cooper Hewitt continue to support these kinds of works? I will say I certainly hope that we would be able to do so. For better or for worse, I think all museums, are frankly quite under-resourced. And the more that our resources and budgets get squeezed, the less that we are able to, to commission work, which I do think is a really important part of design and artistic practice itself, because I think it allows designers and artists to push themselves and to push their work in ways that wasn't always possible. So I hope we could continue to do so. And last question, can Kent talk about passenger pigeons and three-legged dogs?
If I can also talk about hermit crabs.
And hermit crabs.
Yeah. So there's an extraordinary set of images. I'm thinking about trying to get Cooper Hewitt to want to do this, that come from some of the small Pacific islands where there's been a lot of trash that is washed up on the shores, and a lot of it's plastic. And hermit crabs have taken to inhabiting these plastic items, all the way from bottle caps, bottle tops, screw off tops, to the most extraordinary images of a hermit crab inhabiting a doll's head and walking around with a doll's head. And so you have sculpture and creativity going on in a really odd and very unsettling hybrid mix-up. But I could imagine getting live hermit crabs and then giving them a murray as part of the exhibit and watching them pick and choose and move around. Anyway, so that's hermit crabs. Passenger pigeons. So passenger pigeons once were the most abundant bird on Earth. And they occurred in North America, and they were in the billions. There were records of flocks that took 3 days to pass overhead, and they were all killed. The last one was named Martha, and I don't remember the exact date, in the late 1800s that she died in the Philadelphia Zoo. There is an effort that is being pursued in an extraordinarily sort of mission fashion by a gentleman named Ben Novak to recreate passenger pigeons. And they're most closely related is the band-tailed pigeon. And they've identified the genes that they think are necessary and starting to figure out how to crosswalk those genes taken from museum specimens back into band-tailed pigeons to try to get them in enough large enough flocks so that they would recreate the kind of impacts on forests that passenger pigeons seem to have had. So that's something that's sitting in the backyard of Cooper Hewitt should they come back. And he's is an example of some of the attempts that are currently on the very edges of people working on. Three-legged dogs was in response to the question about people owning things. There is a human penchant among some people to look at lost causes and to say, I understand that lost cause, nobody else does, and I will personally try to do something about it. And those lost causes are called three-legged dogs. If I adopt that three-legged dog, I can make it whole, I can make it happy, I can make it good. And there is a set of human reactions to that, which we have to take into consideration when we think about what we're trying to ask people to do with things like seeing the substitute. I don't know if the Smithsonian is doing audience surveys or has done them with that, but it would be really interesting to do a set of surveys and find out how people are responding to that, and actually use that as a sort of interpretation piece of information. I don't know, but we ought to know. And we ought to know, because if we're diffusing knowledge, we need to know what it is that's happening as people attend this extraordinarily significant exhibit that Daisy created and you commissioned.
I'm just can I chime in there? It was on show at the Royal Academy. So Kent, I'm very grateful that you think it's meaningful, because one of the reviewers saw the show called Eco Visionaries that it was part of, and said in her review in the Times, Ginsberg has no answers. Which I thought was, because the request was really for her, the reviewer, that the artists and designers should be offering solutions. And that's what I love about Kent's book, Strange Natures, is that it just lays out the problem and there aren't answers. It's all so complicated, and which way we turn it's so complex, but we need to, how can we evaluate something that's beyond, our ability to solve? And there's all these different kinds of ways that we can to approach. But for most of us, I had no idea about any of this until I met Kent.
I mean, Daisy, that's kind of you to mention the book. And I took to heart something that I read in a book which said that the great works of art don't answer questions, they pose them. And I've been reflecting a lot on that. And the films that I've watched, the movies the books I've read that, have an ending where, and then she walked through the door and he realized that she was the one who had done it. I forget them, right? They ask a question and they answer the question, then I'm done. It doesn't stick. It's the ones that say, and he never found out who she really was. I remember those books from being a teenager, and that's what this does. That's what the substitute does, is it demands work from the person who is observing it. And that reviewer doesn't want to work and wants to be able to say, well, she's wrong because that's not the answer. And
wait, it's
good
true.
on you.
I have no answer, so she was right.
But good for you.
And neither is it your role to necessarily have the answers. So with this, I do want to wrap up and to thank Daisy and to thank Kent for joining us. I mean, to offer just a bit of reflection on all of this. I think that the substitute and just even this conversation this evening illustrates the impact of training one's lens on the external forces that shape the way that we experience the world and the world as it exists currently. I do think that there is incredible value to art that poses questions rather than answering them, that provokes us to think that, not everything is okay the way that it is, and there's still work to be done. And for us all to grow in our own awareness of what that is. It certainly feels overwhelming, but with innovation, we can certainly continue to tackle that. So thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us. This recording will be available on the Viewfinder website, and be sure to visit the Viewfinder website as well to register for the August 5th event, Leslie Thornton on surviving. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you, Kent. Thank you, Daisy. We're incredibly fortunate that you both have joined us this evening. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.